itty bitty car is this?
The news of the death of the great crime boss, Liam McCaffrey, at the age of 76 in prison, shocked the world. According to reports, McCaffrey had no known descendants, but had run a vast global empire of murder, extortion, and theft for decades. An empire solidified by his prior military training. As the world processed this information in a distant city, Jessica was maintaining a facade of normalcy in an elegant bar. Outside, her husband Dan was agilely scaling an apartment building while simultaneously coordinating their mission with his wife. He was giving her instructions on how to secure the package they were searching for. Following his precise directions, Jessica located the key hidden beneath the bar and proceeded to cautiously leave the establishment, using the kitchen to evade security cameras. During her escape, she asked him with a note of concern if he planned to be late for their planned rendezvous. Dan assured her not to worry, stating he was doing his utmost to arrive on time despite the perilous climb. At that exact moment, a shirtless man spotted him from inside his apartment, but chose to simply ignore the unusual sight and carry on with his own affairs. Jessica arrived at apartment 556 and, following Dan's orders, opened the package, revealing a stunning necklace with a large, conspicuous gem. A moment later, Dan slipped into the apartment through the window, making it clear that this was his unique way of arriving for the date they had arranged after a week-long absence. Without further ado, he placed the necklace around her neck, and both were quickly swept away by the building tension of the moment, initiating a series of passionate caresses. In the midst of this intense moment, their son, Kyle, called on the phone.
We'll be right there.
Although Jessica initially proposed ignoring the call, Kyle continued to insist persistently, so she finally decided to answer. On the other end of the line, Kyle desperately informed them that Max, their pet, had just thrown up all over the new sofa. Dan, interrupting Kyle's frantic explanations, immediately ordered him to clean up the mess, warning his son that they would be home soon to personally tend to his brother. Shortly after, the family was enjoying a happy moment in the car, singing together. Even the usually shy teenager Kyle joined the family melody with unexpected genuine enthusiasm.
You're unbelievable!
The drive brought them to their grandparents' house for the Thanksgiving Day celebration, where the whole extended family came out to greet them with great warmth. Once inside, Kyle's uncles offered him some alcohol, but Jessica adamantly refused to let her son drink. Instead, she ordered Kyle to go to the kitchen for more ice for the drinks. The young man immediately complied. However, while positioning the ice bucket on the counter, he inadvertently caused a knife to shoot out at high speed, flying directly towards his grandmother's head. Right at that critical instant, Dan activated his extraordinary reflexes and intercepted the dagger midair, saving his mother from what would have been a terrible accident. Later, Kyle protested that he felt he was old enough, but his family insisted on keeping him at the kids' table for one more year. Dan, meanwhile, interrupted the gathering with a live video call so that Nina could join the family dinner. During the call, their grandfather asked Nina about an article she had written, mentioning he had heard on the news that McCaffrey had died in Las Vegas the previous week. The atmosphere became noticeably tense until Jessica skillfully decided to change the subject of conversation. Later, alone, Jessica revealed to Nina that she had received a significant job offer to take charge of the Ohio track and field team, but she hadn't made a decision yet, as she hadn't even mentioned it to Dan. Accepting the position would mean they would have to relocate. Nina advised her not to waste this great opportunity and to seriously think about her career. Following this, Jessica asked Nina about her return for Christmas, and it was then that Nina revealed that, unfortunately, she would not be able to attend this year's Christmas party. Afterward, just as Kyle was about to continue with his day as if nothing had happened, Dan decided to punish him severely upon discovering that his son had erased the grades of all his high school classmates, so he ordered him to stay home and dedicate his time to completing his college application. The following day, Dan arrived at his office, and his assistant informed him that the Bank of London had inquired about retaining his security services. Dan accepted the offer instantly, deciding to use the job as an excuse to spend Christmas in London. He broke the news to his family while Kyle was practicing driving their car. Kyle strongly opposed the trip, arguing he had a tournament scheduled right in the middle of it. Jessica also voiced her objection, pointing out that their youngest son, Max, had never taken such a long trip and that she would prefer to spend Christmas at home, as they never knew how much more time they had left in that place. However, Dan's persistent argument that home is truly where the family has convinced Jessica to agree, as she believed her compliance would make him more receptive to supporting her future job in Ohio. The family conversation was abruptly cut short when Kyle's inexperience behind the wheel resulted in them crashing into another car. And so, the family arrived in London that night, greeted by the quintessential European Christmas atmosphere. The next day, while heading towards their daughter's hotel, they were struck by the bohemian world of the city streets. Dan even commented that Nina should move out of that neighborhood, deeming it dangerous and illegal. Moments later, they arrived unannounced at Nina's apartment. When Kyle went to the bathroom to relieve himself, he discovered, to his utter surprise, that there was a man taking a shower.
You gotta act like you're happy to see your mom. Oh, whoa! Oh, man.
Reacted immediately, cornering the semi-naked man until Nina intervened, formally introducing him as her Moroccan boyfriend, Omar. Dan proceeded to interrogate him, finding out he was 24, worked as a chef and also as a DJ. Once the initial shock had passed, and as they toured the city together, Nina told her parents she had met Omar because he was a left-wing activist who frequently attended protests. Meanwhile, when Omar spoke with his brother-in-law Kyle, and the teenager mentioned that he found life too boring and focused only on video games, Omar decided to demonstrate just how awesome life can be if one chooses it. Max, the younger brother, was incredibly impressed and decided to try to imitate him, but ended up bumping himself, though nothing serious happened.
Hey!
That was great.
Following this, the family agreed to split up to take care of their separate business and reunite that night to enjoy Christmas together as a family. The next day, Dan left to meet with the bank that had hired him, and Nina took advantage of his absence to chastise her mother for not telling her about the job offer in Ohio. Jessica claimed she was waiting for the perfect opportunity. Subsequently, Nina decided to give Jessica some space and took her brothers to the park along with Omar. On his side, Dan arrived at the bank and immediately started a meticulous examination of the facilities, taking detailed notes on the existing security service. He was soon met by Aiden Clark, the man who had called him, who explained he was looking for a kinetic review of their facilities since they had recently expanded. Dan asked Clark if he was essentially requesting him to infiltrate his own bank right then and there, as part of his testing job, to which Clark confirmed. Thus, Dan proceeded to walk naturally alongside the man through the premises. Thanks to a scanner he was carrying, he managed to clone an access card and open a door. Meanwhile, Jessica was practicing in front of the mirror the perfect way to tell her husband that she wanted to move, right when she received an unexpected visitor. Back with Dan, he explained to Clark the deficiencies of the internal security cameras, pointing out they could be easily hacked. Then, using only a simple paperclip, Dan managed to open yet another door. And when they were discovered by a bank staff member, Dan used his manipulative dialectic to get rid of him. For the next door, Dan used the card he had just stolen from the staff member, managing to access the vault. Once inside, he immediately lunged at Clark, subduing him and demanding that he reveal his true identity. Poking into Clark's pocket, Dan discovered that Clark had located his wife. Clark, calling him by his real name, ordered him to finish stealing deposit box 411 for them, confirming that he had been used all along to infiltrate the vault. Dan complied, discovering that the box contained a digital key recognized as the key to the kingdom. Clark then showed him a photograph of himself alongside his father and the maid's son, named Finn. At that moment, Dan realized that the man in front of him was that boy, and that they were actually half-brothers, as their father had never wanted to acknowledge him or give him his last name. With that, Clark explained that his plan was to keep the key, while Dan took all the blame, knowing Dan couldn't go to the police, as his connection to McCaffrey would result in his execution. With no choice, Dan continued the plan, faking that he was using his brother as a hostage to move smoothly through the bank.
Got a gun! He says he'll kill me! Shut up. I got you out! Where is he?
Once outside, Clark handed back his wife, who had a gun taped to her hand to incriminate her as well. With no options left as the police were about to arrive, the couple began a frantic chase through the corridors, which led them into a nearby bar. Meanwhile, Clark was already basking in his victory until he discovered, with great frustration, that his brother had stolen the key from him at the last minute. Enraged, he immediately ordered a turnaround and headed back to the hotel. far from there, the siblings Kyle and Nina were talking until Dan called them, ordering them to stay put in the park and immediately get rid of their cell phones for security reasons. Kyle thought it was a joke, but hearing Nina, she understood they were involved in serious trouble again and instantly obeyed. Moments later, the family reunited just as Clark realized they had changed direction and joined the pursuit. The family managed to get far enough to enter the commercial zone where they boarded a double-decker bus. However, they were immediately spotted by Clark, who caught up and aimed a gun at them. Clark demanded that Dan tell his family how their own father had abandoned him to fend for himself, and then he demanded the key back. Dan responded by lunging at him until he was disarmed, initiating an intense, brutal hand-to-hand battle on the roof of the moving bus. During the fight, Clark bitterly accused him that while his brother spent 20 years selling used cars, he was doing all their father's dirty work.
Spent 20 years selling used cars. Certified pre-owned.
At one point during the fight, Clark gained the upper hand and was ready to stab his brother, but Jessica arrived just in time to attack him with a fire extinguisher. Despite the blow, Clark managed to grab her as a hostage. Out of options, Dan dropped the key, prompting his brother to abandon everything to chase after it on the road. Once safe, Dan took his family to a Chinese restaurant, where he reconnected with an old friend named Zemo, who returned a favor by handing him a bag containing his essential belonging. Having done this, Dan decided to explain the truth to his family. His father owned a house in Ireland where they used to spend their summers, and it turned out he had a son with the housekeeper. Dan also explained that they urgently needed to escape from London. Nina opposed, arguing that she already had an established life in the city. However, Dan made them understand that now that his brother possessed the key, he had access to all their father's money, as well as the contacts needed to hire all his assassins and surveillance systems, which put the entire family in imminent danger. Dan explained to his family that they couldn't go to the police because he had been forced to rob a bank, and Clark possessed solid proof of all his past crimes. After this moment of tension, we saw Clark arrive in Paris, while the family, including Omar, who refused to abandon his girlfriend Nina, used a boat to head into international waters. During the journey, Nina bitterly criticized her father, saying that when she arrived in London, she had felt great, because even if it sounded stupid, she felt she could change the world. But now, because of her father's past, they were on the run again. She added that all this gave her brother Kyle enough reason to remain angry with them. Meanwhile, Clark arrived at a mansion in Paris, where he was greeted by the butler named Vikram. Clark explained that following his father's death, he was there to take charge of the family business. Vikram was initially resistant, claiming he had received no signal from McCaffrey before his passing, but he immediately changed his mind upon seeing that Clark possessed the digital key. Once inside the mansion, Clark demonstrated his new power by smashing all the photographs of his father and, using the key, gained access to the system that connected him to the world of assassins and the over $500 million in his bank account. Meanwhile, Dan explained to his family that they had to go to Paris to finish things with his brother, as that was the city where he had grown up. This surprised Jessica, as she had never been aware of that aspect of his past. So, after an uncomfortable journey in a crowded animal transport truck, and despite Jessica's clear displeasure, Dan convinced his family to stay at the home of Svetlana, a former Russian spy. Dan assured them that although they had a relationship in the past, it had been nothing serious. Jessica felt jealous at the thought that Svetlana might be a beautiful woman. However, when they finally met her, they discovered she was now an eccentric, passionate cat lady who, to Jessica's relief, still harbored an old, harmless affection for Dan. Svetlana showed them that their escape in London had been reported in the newspapers. Then, Dan told her what had happened with his brother and asked for her help connecting to his father's old services. Thus, Dan soon managed to arrange a meeting with Clark in Paris. Jessica feared for her husband's life, but Dan promised her he would be extremely careful. In this way, Dan showed up at a museum to meet with his brother. There, Clark told him that in the past, when he was just 12 years old, he waited outside the mansion in the rain for hours just to catch a glimpse of the life his father enjoyed with Dan. And while he wanted to get closer to yell that he was part of the family too, he couldn't move because his legs were frozen from the extreme cold. With that, Clark alleged he was fully aware that their father even tried to kill Dan because he abandoned the family. Dan asserted that if he had known about their connection in the past, he would have treated him as family, and that he was only there now because he wanted to end the whole situation before it got worse. However, Clark refused to give up the whole empire of unlimited resources for a simple family relationship. Dan warned him that their father was crazy and that he had no problem with him keeping all the money, but he strongly advised him not to follow in their father's footsteps because now that he was no longer alive, he had nothing to prove to anyone. Still, Clark refused to take the advice. Then, Dan proceeded to warn him that if he didn't stop his whole plan against him, he would show him the ruthless killer their father had raised, swearing that if he went near his family, he would tear him to pieces. However, without wasting any time, Clark immediately hired an entire team of elite assassins and offered to pay triple to whoever could take Dan out. While preparing for the impending war, Dan told his wife that the meeting with his brother had gone poorly. As an offering of peace amid the danger, Dan decided to use the free time to have the entire family spend Christmas in Paris, attempting to create a facade of normalcy. Later, while his family slept, Dan met with Svetlana for a drink to thank her for her help. At that moment, Svetlana proceeded to apologize, revealing that she had decided to turn him over to his brother in exchange for the bounty. She had done this by slipping sleeping pills into his drink, and although she was now remorseful after meeting his family, she could no longer undo it. Her only recourse was to warn him that the assassins were closing in on the house. Dan immediately woke his family, warning them of the danger. Svetlana explained that although she had betrayed them in the past, she was now trying to help by giving them her car keys so they could escape. As they boarded the vehicle, they realized there were already men outside the house. With no other options, Kyle took the wheel, but since the car was a manual, he struggled to move forward, so his mother had to quickly help him with the clutch. Thus, they abandoned the house, starting a chase through the city and its Christmas decorations, all while dodging the shotgun blasts from their relentless pursuers. They soon arrived at a dangerous crossroad, as they were forced to drive down a set of stairs, which seemed like certain death. However, Kyle managed to stabilize the vehicle at the last moment and continued their escape until, after a heavy impact, they finally managed to shake off the assassins.
Drive, Kyle!
Oh my god!
Whose itty-bitty car is this?
The next day, once Dan recovered from the effects of the sleeping pills, he explained that his plan was to take his family to a place where they could have a normal life and that he would most likely have to take the fall for the alleged bank robbery to protect them. However, Nina appeared with her brothers to make it clear that they had no intention of abandoning him and would stick together. Dan accepted their support, and thus the family understood that they couldn't live on the run forever. But they also couldn't reveal their true identity, as Dan would go to prison and their enemies would retaliate by attacking their family. Faced with this, Omar proposed contacting his father, claiming he could help them. However, no one took his suggestion seriously. Instead, they decided they had to attack Clark. To do this, they positioned themselves outside his brother's house, as Dan revealed that he spent his childhood in that mansion, where he even had a butler named Bikram. Then, because the mansion was heavily guarded by multiple assassins, in addition to its security systems, Dan explained that they had to enter through the roof. Here, Kyle handed him a device for Dan to introduce into the assassin network system so that he could eliminate the covert files and prevent the existence of killers operating from the shadows. With that said, the plan was put into action. Dan and Omar proceeded to scale the mansion walls, expertly bypassing the security cameras, while Nina recorded all their conversations for the plot. They managed to surprise one of the snipers, whom they subdued without much trouble, and although he pulled out a hidden weapon, Dan quickly subdued him again. Right at that moment, Clark called on the communicator demanding a report. Immediately, Kyle used the sniper's recording to falsify his words as a routine response. Thus, Dan and Omar continued their advance. While below, Omar's activist friends began to act to provoke a massive distraction, guided by Nina, accusing Clark of being a capitalist pig. The demonstration caught the attention of the police, who confronted Nina demanding her passport. To prevent her from being discovered and the plan being ruined, Omar decided to destroy a car, causing a large explosion to divert the police's attention. Meanwhile, Dan continued with his plan, retrieving a box of his belongings that he had kept hidden in the mansion walls. Using a crowbar, he managed to infiltrate the attic, where he was reunited with his old room and all his childhood memories. However, he was soon discovered by his brother, who aimed a gun at him and reminded him that, in their childhood, Dan had told him how to get in and out of their castle in Paris. Clark planned to assassinate him immediately, but Vikram warned him that the mansion had an exclusive room designated for such events. Clark agreed to follow protocol, and as he guided his brother toward his fatal destination, Dan subtly dropped a device and contacted his family, ordering them to abort the mission and leave him behind to continue with their lives. Immediately, Clark discovered the microphone and camera, and although he understood his family was very close, he chose to ignore it and move on. Jessica prepared to follow her husband's orders and disappear immediately, but her children flat out refused to abandon their father and, moreover, pointed out that the hacking device was still inside the mansion unguarded. Moments later, Jessica changed her mind, deciding she would personally enter to save her husband, and ordered her children that if anything went wrong, they had to escape immediately to the embassy. Thus, we saw Jessica successfully climb onto the roof of the neighboring building, but a sheer gap of several meters stretched out before her. Seeing this, Nina warned her mother not to attempt the jump, as it was far too dangerous. However, Jessica recalled that she had successfully made a similar leap in Las Vegas, as well as in college, where she managed to jump a distance of 5 meters. Determined, she took the necessary running distance and, with a powerful surge of momentum, successfully reached the other side. Meanwhile, inside, Clark chastised his brother for involving his family and ordered his assassins to find his sister-in-law and nephews to execute them. For her part, Jessica infiltrated through the same attic opening, reaching her husband's old playroom, where she retrieved the hacking device. Nearby, Vikram was guiding everyone to the sublevel while Dan chatted with the butler, reminiscing about old times like the day his father locked him up for 4 whole days for talking back. Now, in position, Dan asked the butler if he thought their father truly would have wanted this, to which Vikram claimed that, indeed, he would have. But just as Clark fired, we saw that the butler, Vikram, activated a secret trap that ended up dropping Dan to a lower floor, which, ironically, also saved his life. Upon witnessing this betrayal, Clark harshly rebuked him for his action. However, Vikram made it clear that he knew very well that despite their differences, McCaffrey would have wanted him to protect his son, Dan. Clark struck the butler but did not kill him. Instead, he sent his hitmen after his brother. Meanwhile, Jessica reached the operations desk where she inserted the device, allowing her son Kyle to start accessing the mansion's data and system itself. Thus, they warned their mother that someone was approaching. She tried to escape, but the doors were locked, so she was forced to hide in a closet. The assassin, armed with a sword, arrived and soon detected her presence in the closet. But before she could attack, Jessica burst out of her hiding place and managed to knock her down, giving herself a chance to escape. Still, the assassin caught up to her, but we saw that Jessica's skill helped her block her attacks with furniture and dodge the others with her own fighting ability. Jessica managed to evade the assassin's heavy attacks, and having no other option, began to fight. Back by throwing books until she managed to disarm the killer with one of them, Jessica immediately knocked her out with a statuette straight to the head. Several floors below, through the corridors that resembled catacombs, Dan warned his brother that even if he didn't want the house, it still belonged to him. Thus, Dan used his deep knowledge of the mansion to cut the lights, which helped him dodge the projectiles aimed at him. Then he surprised the first assassin and subdued him by smashing an entire wine collection over him. The second assassin discovered him and unleashed a hail of gunfire. But when he ran out of ammunition, Dan lunged at him and also slammed him against the wine racks. At the same time, the children realized that the assassins had located them and were quickly approaching their car, which refused to stop.
It's the guy from last night.
Mom, we've got company. Crap, the battery's dead.
Kyle, please, can you do it a little faster? The car's not working.
Kyle rushed his hacking methods, injecting a virus into the system. With no options, they were forced to continue on foot here. Nina publicly accused the assassin of being an ally of the oil companies, successfully causing the protesters to throw themselves at him and delay him long enough for them to escape. When Jessica reached the car, she found it empty, following her instincts in search of her children. On the other hand, when Clark returned to his mansion, he discovered that his system had been thoroughly hacked, as all his money was being transferred and his files were being deleted. Right then, Dan appeared, greeting him with a smile, seeing that his entire plan was thwarted. Blinded by rage, Clark drew his pistol and began to chase his brother, swearing he would murder his entire family. But Dan intercepted him along the way and managed to disarm him, starting yet another battle that extended onto the rooftop as both smashed through the window. Here, Dan advised his brother to give up, since their father's empire no longer existed. Even so, Clark refused to accept, and the fight continued into a church, where they struggled high up on a bell undergoing renovation. With his first attack, Clark managed to knock Dan down, but when he was ready to deliver the final blow, he discovered that his brother had vanished. Far from there, the children were trying to hide inside a carousel. They were soon located by their mother, but at the same time, by the assassin. Even so, they managed to distract him long enough for Jessica to arrive, and together, they threw him out of the carousel. Moments later, they called the attention of the police, seeking their protection, as in exchange, they gave up their identity as the assailants from England. Back on the bell, Dan revealed to Clark that if he had presented himself as his brother from the beginning, he could have been part of their family, but instead, he chose to attack them. But Clark made it clear that he was only seeking to kill him, and that he didn't need his father's empire, as he always rose from nothing on his own. Face to face again, the battle resumed, with both violently hitting the bell repeatedly. At one point, Clark warned him that he should surrender because he would never win. However, Dan made it clear that he still had something to fight for, unlike his brother, who had nothing. In this way, Dan capitalized on his brother's rage to trap him with a rope, tying him securely to the bell. He let him fall, and although Clark thought he would die, he was only left suspended in the air in the center of the church. Following this, Dan walked outside, where he was met by the French police and arrested along with his family. Nearby, he observed that Vikram, the butler, was still alive. Once aboard the police van, Kyle revealed to his sister that he had transferred their grandfather's $500 million to Greenpeace as an unexpected Christmas present. From the van, Dan watched as the police also took his brother Clark into custody. Moments later, a governmental car arrived at the scene from which Omar and his father emerged. His father turned out to be the Secretary General of Interpol. Amidst the introductions, Jessica finally worked up the courage to reveal to her husband that she had accepted a job offer in Ohio. Max, the youngest son, seized the distraction to hug a Santa Claus passing by the park. 11 months later in Ohio, we see the family has moved to support Jessica's career. There, via a video call, Dan spoke with Omar, regretting that he couldn't visit them, but advised him to focus on his studies and assured him he still expected to see him for Christmas. After watching his youngest son already practicing parkour with his authorization, Nina and Kyle arrived to spend Thanksgiving Day together. But just before the end, we saw that a month later, Clark, in prison, received a visit from his brother, who handed him his Christmas gift, the coat he had always wanted, and they decided to spend the remaining time playing cards.